Hey, folks, welcome to the second hour of American Agenda. I'm Bob Sellers.
And I'm Heather Childers, and we're now joined by our family of co-hosts, beginning with lawyer and GOP strategist Ford O'Connell, host of Money Talk with Melanie and member of Project 21, Melanie Collette, and director for the American Center for Political Leadership and former Florida Congressman Dennis Ross. Welcome to everyone. You know, House Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee have released this new report raising new concerns that COVID leaked from the Wuhan lab and alleging that Chinese officials and American officials engaged in a cover-up. For the latest, let's check in with our very own White House correspondent, Emerald Robinson, live once again from Washington, D.C. Hi, Emerald.
Hi, Heather, that's right. This updated report suggests that the preponderance of the evidence points directly to the Wuhan Institute of Virology lab. But now what's interesting is it also goes into detail about both Chinese scientists and officials and also U.S. experts that they say help to engage in a cover-up. In fact, it specifically points to EcoHealth Alliance CEO Peter Daszak. In the report, it says, quote, "We have uncovered strong evidence that suggests Peter Daszak is a public face of a CCP disinformation campaign designed to suppress public discussion about a potential lab leak." And the report, McCall and others go on to highlight how he coordinated a campaign for the Lancet to have several scientists sign on to the idea that the lab leak theory was debunked. He also called anyone who suggested that it was the origin a conspiracy theorist. Now, as a part of this report, the actionable items that McCall is looking for essentially comes down to three different items. Number one, he's calling for a bipartisan investigation into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. Number two, he's proposing legislation that the U.S. Congress pass in order to sanction Wuhan lab scientists and CCP officials who engaged in the cover-up. And number three, he's asking to subpoena Peter Daszak to come before Congress and testify about his actions, Heather.
Yeah,
Emerald, as a matter of fact, I wanted to ask you, Emerald, what do you think they want to find out from Peter Daszak very specifically?
I think very specifically they want to know exactly how engaged possibly the NIH and the NIAID was with his work, and how much communication there was. In fact, you have Senator Ron Johnson asking for more unredacted emails from Dr. Fauci and how much he might have been coordinating on messaging, even with the teachers' unions. I think also they want to know exactly what went into this research, exactly how much manipulation they were doing and what did they know they were doing. And also, I think they want to know how aware was Daszak of a possible leak from that Wuhan lab. Remember, this report highlights that that the lab had asked for extra money to update its security systems, like its hazardous waste product system, and it was only that particular facility was less than 2 years old. That leak, as they say, is that request is a smoking gun to a leak. After which, you know, there were more cases seen with COVID-like symptoms around the Wuhan area.
Yeah. Emerald, thank you very much. Let's bring in our panel to weigh in on this topic. I'll start with you, Ford. What's your take on what's going on here?
Well, this is the single biggest cover-up in the history of the modern world. Millions of lives have been lost and hundreds of trillions of dollars in economic damage have occurred, and we need to get to the bottom of this. And I will say, if you look back at the pandemics over the last 2 decades, it should come as no surprise that this did in fact come from a lab. And based on the actions at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it most likely came from that lab. And, you know, the only pandemic in the last 2 decades that didn't come from a lab, I believe, is actually Ebola. Here's the problem, though. The Democrats on Capitol Hill and President Biden don't want to get to the bottom of this because they're addicted to ruling by emergency. They get to trample individual liberties. They get to move this country closer to socialism. And why? Because we have to fight back against the pandemic.
Yeah, Heather, it seems like Daszak is also this character that keeps popping up when it comes to that Wuhan lab, and that there are a lot of unanswered questions that he might be able to answer.
Well, I mean, we know that at least 9 grants went specifically to DASIC and EcoHealth Alliance, dealing specifically with bat coronaviruses, this type of research that was being done. And I definitely agree with the third part of what Emerald Robinson was talking about for us there, and that is subpoenaing Peter Daszak and having him come forward and answering some of these questions. We also know that in some of those redacted emails that were sent back and forth, specifically Peter Daszak sending an email to Dr. Fauci requesting that he withhold or lessen some of the information about the Wuhan lab, specifically when the outbreak happened. So he's definitely tied into it. He definitely needs to answer some questions, a lot of questions, and I think that would be a first step in accomplishing some of that.
Yeah. Melanie, why does this all matter? Why do we need to get to the bottom of where it came from, how it got out, who was funding it? By the way, that's assuming that it's not too late, that, you know, it's not out the barn door already.
Well, because some 4 million people have died, some 600,000 Americans have died because of this pandemic. And it's very important to find out whether this was intentional, whether it was a lab leak. You know, I'm still not positive that this was not an intentional attack from China. And
Right.
I have no confidence in the Biden administration that if it was an intentional attack from China, that they have any interest in finding anything like that out, because they're in bed with China.
Yeah. Dennis, you've been a member of Congress. Can they get to the bottom of this if they are in the minority? I mean, we've got Republican congressmen pushing for this, but are they going to have to depend on some Democrats to go along with them?
They're going to absolutely have to, Bob. And let me just tell you, when you're in the minority, you basically take whatever they throw your way and they control the agenda. What's interesting is that Mike McCall has concluded in his report that the preponderance of the evidence shows that this came out of a laboratory in Wuhan. More importantly, with the NIH giving the grants that they have, it gives a real significant issue as to whether or not the NIH was complicit in this. And when we talk about the politics of the pandemic, which is what we're in right now, not only the origination and the devastation that's done, but the response, the restrictions, the mandates, the economy that has tanked because of this, there has to be a significant investigation. It would be wise for the majority to wash their hands and get involved in a true investigation of this.
Yeah. Heather, we had a guest on last hour, Congressman Burchett from Tennessee, that was saying to people, don't be so naive. They were creating this. The Chinese were trying to create it for population control. Now, I don't want to misquote him on that, but that makes it sound like this was not an accident. Whether it got out was an accident, I guess, remains a question.
Yes, this particular new report does say that it was accidentally released, but I think that, he brought up a lot of good points in that just from the bottom line reasoning why we are sending money and why we are aiding this type of research that's going on in communist China. And I believe his point being that, we trust them too much, and that perhaps that's one of the things that we need to take away from this, and that we shouldn't be doing these things in communist China within these labs that are being used by the military for nefarious purposes.
After what's it been, a year and a half, and really almost 2 years since this thing was discovered, we have so many questions we still don't know about. And in this day and age, to not be able to find that out, I think a lot of people want questions answered, and it's high time they go that
And can
route.
I just make one other point about Peter Daszak?
Yeah, you bet.
Remember the WHO, and when they launched their investigation initially, Peter Daszak, who had funded the Wuhan lab, was the only American scientist that was involved in that investigation.
That's right.
So
Yeah.
there's some question as to whether or not any of the information that we need to have at this point now we'll no longer be able to find.
There was certainly no transparency in that, and he
Right.
didn't help that effort to have transparency. So
No.
we'll leave this subject right here. Coming up, folks, thank you, panel, stand by.